So it's finally here. Earlier today, CDPR gave us the massive update on the future of Cyberpunk 2077. Their fiscal year 2021 just recently ended, and they had an accompanying earnings call for the year of 2021, sharing some details on the performance of Cyberpunk 2077, its copies sold, which actually is a little bit rough, but more importantly, what is coming next, touching on patch 1.6, the expansions, multiplayer, and more. This is that bigger update on Cyberpunk's future that we have been waiting for, because otherwise CDPR has actually been pretty quiet recently. And hey, if you enjoy the content, you can leave a like or subscribe. I'm actually filming this from Disney World, because of course CDPR releases this the day I go to Disney World. So one of the first things they get into is seemingly a preventative measure to avoid another disastrous launch like Cyberpunk 2077 for CD Projekt Red. They set up Red Team representatives, which are team members elected by popular vote to advise the board of directors. So seemingly if things are going horribly in the development of a game, this will be a preventative measure, somebody that could be like, hey, to the board, to the highest level, maybe we should delay this, or this is what's going wrong or right in development. From CDPR's point of view, the release of the next-gen version of Cyberpunk has led to a sizable positive improvement to the Cyberpunk brand. And they further expand on this to say that Cyberpunk 2077, up until just about this point, if you're watching this video when it came out, has sold 18 million copies. And although yes, we are looking at the fiscal year 2021 earnings, these are copies sold through April 2022, which at first glance actually looks pretty great. 18 million copies is a lot of video games being sold, but when you compare it to the fact that Cyberpunk 2077 actually sold nearly 14 million copies in 2020, seems like the exact number here was around 13.7 million copies in 2020, this means that in the past year and 4 months, only 4 million copies were sold of Cyberpunk 2077, and many of these are likely copies that were sold at a sale price because the game has had some fairly decent discounts as of late, and actually some of these being incredibly cheap depending on the retailer. And of course, these copies sold, that 18 million number, or more specifically the roughly 4 million since the initial release year, does include the sales boost from the next-gen version release. So it's not like it's doing crazy numbers with the next-gen release. And it's worth noting that at one point CDPR was hoping to get to around 30 million units sold, which is obviously still possible. There's a lot of lifespan potentially left in this game, but I can't imagine they're happy with only selling 4 million copies in a year plus of time. That's one of the situations where 18 million copies sold is huge, but it's definitely not as huge or as massive as people were hoping or expecting with Cyberpunk, especially if you go back to the summer of 2020 before release. And if you even just look at the stock price, I think this very clearly reflects that. This game was expected to perform better than it ended up forming, and this is a clear indication that that negative word of mouth had a massive impact, even though on day one there were still a lot of copies sold. Another pretty key data point they have shared is on employee distribution. What is everyone working on at the company? And there are quite a few interesting takeaways from this one. The biggest standout is the yellow chunk, which is the ongoing support for Cyberpunk 2077, and you can see how things have gotten notably smaller since the last update. The timing of this image is pretty important. It actually is at the end of February, the last day of February, aka just a few weeks after patch 1.5 dropped. I imagine patch 1.5 was the big push, and once that very successfully dropped, many people moved on to other projects at CDPR. And as we see it right now, Cyberpunk 2077, this is the ongoing maintenance of the game as well as next-gen support, does have less developers than Gwent, which Gwent is getting its whole single-player standalone thing, but at the same time, that's a pretty crazy statistic. But they definitely give some color to this, and they have a few interesting quotes to note. They say how, on the topic of Cyberpunk, we are now satisfied with the game and encouraged by the gamers' reception of its next-gen console edition, which launched this February, as well as how the vast part of the job in updating the game is already done and was done in 2021, which they said during the earnings call. But they do make it clear they are going to continue supporting Cyberpunk. They do reveal that patch 1.6 is in development, and we can expect it in the next couple of months. They're using a month's timeline, so I doubt it's coming in the next couple of weeks. But otherwise, they don't really provide any further details. Patch 1.6 exists and it is being worked on, but otherwise we don't know much. Although they word this in a very interesting way. After patch 1.6, support for Cyberpunk will continue, but our focus will gradually shift to our new exciting endeavors in Cyberpunk and the Witcher franchises, which to me makes me think, is this the last big patch? We saw patch 1.5, we saw patch 1.3, those are monumental releases releases for this game, some of the biggest updates it'll ever get. Maybe patch 1.6 is the last planned huge patch, and from there they're going to transition more to some of the smaller patches or just more maintenance bug fixes. Obviously that's pure speculation on my part. I just found that quote, what they said during the earnings call, pretty interesting. How they almost describe how post patch 1.6 will be kind of a transition period with people working on other projects like the expansions and of course the next Witcher game. But again, they do mention a gradual shift, not like a switch is just going to flip right after patch 1.6. And this overall is interesting to me, and I don't inherently think this has to be a bad thing. I'm curious about this. Cyberpunk 2077 is reaching a point where there isn't a ton more fixing to do, and they probably got as much performance as they possibly could out of last gen consoles. Obviously there's a lot of things people want for and from this game, a rework to the police system, a full metro system, but maybe that stuff is either just never coming or that's not stuff that's going to actually be in the general maintenance of Cyberpunk, but rather things that are going to ship with expansions. Outside of the employees just on Cyberpunk, we can see there's a lot of people at CDPR currently working on Cyberpunk expansions, of which we're expecting at least 2 of them, and a ton more are working on the Witcher 3 and other projects. And on the topic of expansions, they do reveal that the first expansion coming to Cyberpunk 2077 will drop in 2023. I've been saying this for a little while now that this was probably happening, and it doesn't really shock me, but obviously that's still really far. It'll be a full 2 years between the release of the game and the release of the first expansion, which for some people will simply just be too long. This situation with Cyberpunk 2077 is complicated. They had to fix the game, which I think you could argue really took about a year. If you consider the game fixed now with patch 1.5, that's basically a full extra year and then some of development time, which means everything else got pushed back as a result. And my big question is, are people still going to be interested? There's still a ton of free DLCs that haven't released, but they're relatively minor, and I can't imagine people coming back just for a car or new clothing items or things like that at this point. And when it comes to the expansions, I wonder if people will still be interested. The expansions will surely be content rich and bring people back. CDPR probably has one of the best reputations in gaming when it comes to their expansions, specifically for The Witcher 3, but for these smaller free DLCs, to me it just feels like the clock is ticking and they really have to get these out sooner rather than later if they want to maintain that player interest or even just have a good player count on the free DLCs. And of course, when it comes to that 2023 date, we do have that scheduling matter. Starfield is coming later this year. There are rumors that Avowed is coming in Q1 of 2023. There'll be some direct competition with Cyberpunk's first expansion when it comes to the ultimate goal of player attention and, more importantly, players' wallets. There's gonna be a lot of other stuff out around that time that may just satiate players and they may not be super interested in the first expansion. Plus, they may gradually lose interest in the game. A 2-year gap is a really long one. There's some interesting questions about the Epic partnership in regards to multiplayer, and this quote came right at the end of the earnings call as one of the final questions, but to me it is incredibly interesting. The question being, is multiplayer still coming to Red Engine, and even more importantly, is Cyberpunk still getting multiplayer support? And they say how they are switching multiplayer activities from Red Engine to Unreal because they signed a license agreement with Epic, and Unreal Engine already has multiplayer features. This is the quote that got me curious, and it's an exact quote. So as a result, we've abandoned adding multiplayer features to Red Engine, which is crazy to me. I mean, on paper, yeah, it makes sense. Unreal Engine has multiplayer features already. It's going to require less work to add full-scale multiplayer functionality, but at the same time, Cyberpunk's on Red Engine. So when they're saying here they're abandoning adding multiplayer features to Red Engine and just going to stick with Unreal going forward, does that mean no more multiplayer in Cyberpunk? Is Cyberpunk multiplayer going to somehow be an Unreal project even though the base game is on Red Engine? It's very curious. They were very cagey and don't want to give answers about future things, and even around multiplayer, they don't say much. I'm surprised they gave this much of an answer. But maybe the Cyberpunk multiplayer dream is coming to an end. As you start to look at this timeline, the first of potentially or probably 2 expansions coming in 2023. If we don't even see multiplayer then until 2024, maybe there just isn't enough interest. Maybe then they're just going to start looking at adding multiplayer to their next title, or even to The Witcher 3, which has a lot more critical success, and even as we see during this, a lot more copies sold. Although obviously The Witcher 3 also on Red Engine, so you still have that same problem. Although on the same topic, they do mention how there's been no layoffs for people working on multiplayer, and they need these people to bring multiplayers to their games one day, as well as they expect the development of future games to be more predictable, efficient, and stable thanks to Unreal Engine 5. They also think this will speed things up despite it being a different engine. They're of course switching from Red Engine to Unreal Engine, as they'll no longer need to train new hires for Red Engine and have several people already in CDPR that are quite experienced with Unreal. And although Unreal Engine 4 has this reputation of being pretty bad or not having a lot of functionality for open world games, they believe that Unreal Engine 5 is actually much more well equipped for open world games, and it won't have the same hurdles or struggles that Unreal Engine 4 did have. And they finally touch on The Witcher 3 Next Gen. If you didn't see the news, recently CDPR announced that The Witcher 3 Next Gen is not coming out in Q2 of 2022, as well as they actually seemingly fired the developer. I don't know if that's directly true, but Saber Interactive was making this, and now they're not making it, and CDPR is working on it in-house themselves. There's no current release date, but they do clarify here that although it is technically indefinitely delayed and that there is a release date, it isn't a monumental delay. They don't think this is coming out in summer of 2023 or anything like that. And they mentioned how they have about 15 people working on this internally right now. So overall, a very interesting call. They share details on a lot of different things, and it is nice to get some updates on these things. But if anything, I'm still left with a lot of questions. When are these DLCs coming? When actually is that first expansion? Is it going to be a February release just like patch 1.5, or perhaps summer of 2023, which would be brutal. That is a very, very long time, almost approaching 3 years since the release of the game, about 2.5 or 2 and some change. Either way, those are my thoughts. That's the update I do have for all of you. If you guys enjoy, you can get subscribed. With that, I thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.